I started working on the layout of the drawers, and this is one of the back panels that was too small. I worked out all the drawer spacing on here. I went with kind of a random arrangement of the heights of the drawers, and I think that's going to work out with what I have intended for the drawer fronts. We'll get to that on the other side of the mountain of making the drawers. There's 9 drawers here, and plus the one on the vertical side times 20. So I will let you do the math. I'm afraid to. So with this, I've marked the location of the drawer runner, or the bottom of the drawer runner. And if I add on this spacer, which is the thickness of the drawer outside of the rabbet, I can get a direct measurement from the bottom of this spacer to where the drawer runner is. And then I've got another jig. I don't know if I can really call this a jig. It's just a piece of plywood with a block of wood glued to it. So this is the height of the top drawer runner. And this block is square to the top edge and flush, and it's square to the panel. So I can just put this in here and mark where that drawer goes just by shifting this around, and I know it's going to be in the same spot all the way around. But there's a slight problem. So when I was working on the dividers, I noticed that some of them, when they're flush to the bottom of the rabbet in the back, they aren't flush at the top. And the reason for that is because when I flattened the faces, I didn't make sure that they were square to the sides of the case. They're all pretty close, and I didn't care, basically. And now it's a problem. The worst one that I have, the top front of the case is about 3/32 further out than the bottom, which is not a huge amount, over 20 inches. Most of them are really close to being straight. It's really only one of them that's bad. This one, the divider is sticking out like it's really bad, but it's actually, the problem is with the divider and not the case. So what I'm going to do, rather than try to fix the cases that are bad, that would involve setting up the drum sander again. And that's way more work than just dealing with the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shim the divider where it needs it to make it flush. Because it's important for the drawer runners to be parallel to each other. If they're skewed at each other, the drawer is always going to rock inside of there. It's a huge pain in the butt if that happens. So I need to make sure that doesn't happen. So getting that shimmed in there and then all marked evenly, I shouldn't have any problems with that. So once I get that first one marked on all of them, then I can just cut the bottom of this panel to the next measurement and mark all 20 again and cut it and mark it again and again. Once I got down to the lower section, I had to switch to marking on the underside. And I'm using 2 jigs so I can mark 2 lines each time I move a case through to get things done faster. So having marked all the drawer guide locations, the obvious next thing to do would be to make the drawer guides. But I'm not doing that because, well, 2 reasons. Number one, doing all that marking was really tedious and boring. And gluing on all the drawer guides is going to be even more tedious and boring. And I would really like to do something more physical and just be doing something active. And the next thing to do after that is to start working on the drawers. And so it would be a good idea to start working on preparing the stock for that because I need to resaw some of it for the thinner parts on the front and back, and I would like to, resaw that and give it a chance to rest. So if it's going to move, I want that to move before I do the final milling. So a lot of people for jewelry boxes will use fancy woods on the interior, and I don't usually like to do that. I usually like to just have the design of the piece speak for itself and not rely on using fancy woods. And with 20 of these to make, it's a fair amount of wood that I'm going to be using. So I've got a bunch of walnut that either has sapwood or it doesn't have the greatest color. And it's, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, it tends not to work with walnut that has better color. You don't want to mix the two. And so it just doesn't tend to get used on certain projects. But I've got a bunch of it, and I think it's a good use for the drawers for these, since the drawer fronts are going to be walnut too, but with nice color. So before I got into the larger boards, I went through all my scrap wood, and I picked out the lighter colored pieces that were big enough, and I was able to get about half of the stock for the fronts and backs. And I've done the math here, and I need about 18 board feet for the front and backs, and it's going to be double that for the sides because I'm not resawing those. And that's without any waste. So it's probably be more like at least 20 for the fronts and backs and 40 for the sides. And I've got about 60 here, and I've done half of it already for the fronts and backs. So I should have enough here. Yeah, so that wasn't enough. I decided to make one extra drawer of each size, and plus I need all the material for the internal dividers for the drawers, which is going to add up. So I had to go down and sort through the pile and look for the worst walnut that I could find, and pay full price for it. So I finished ripping down what I needed to rip down. So I got all of that tucked out of the way so I could go back to doing the drawer runners. So I'm making these out of soft maple, and I was really picky about the grain. I wanted it to be as straight as possible, and I especially didn't want any reversing grain. So I'm not only just worried about stability, which isn't that big of a problem because it's going to be glued its whole length, so once it's glued in there, it can't really go anywhere. But when I'm fitting the drawers, I may have to go in there with a hand plane to adjust the fit. And I don't want to have to deal with any reversing grain when I'm doing that. So I thought it was worth the time now to sort through and only use the good stock without any little knots or any weirdness going on. The stock I had already been planed down to 1 inch, and that was wide enough for me to get 2 runners out of. So I first ripped them to get the narrower straight piece that goes on the side with the divider. Now on the other side, I've got this curve to deal with, and so each runner has to be cut at a different angle to match that changing curve. Now to find that angle, I could mess around with a bevel gauge, but I've got one of these little digital boxes, and I can just put that on the outside of the curve and get the angle that way. So before I can glue them on, I need to sand the front edge because you're going to see that. And where that front edge is important because that acts as the stop for the drawer. So it's going to set the reveal for the drawer ultimately. So to get those all positioned evenly, I cut a strip of plywood and bent that around on the inside. And that way I can just butt them up right against that stop. Now to glue them on, I'm using the CA glue trick again. And as long as you're quick about it, the activator gives you just enough time to get it positioned perfectly on your lines.